Alrighty, so welcome to the game design workshop. This week we'll be discussing giving the player compelling choices. So this is a workshop and we'll be discussing games and what we can do as designers to enhance their experience through giving them choices and what we can do to improve the types of choices that we give them. So, and what we'll be learning is what is player choice in game design, why do we use it, why do we use it in relation to the player experience, and what makes for effective and not effective player choices, mostly subjectively and objectively through games. Any questions before we begin? Great. So, what are player choices? Just if you want to shout it out, what you think it means in games, or just in general.
The option that players have to do things inside of a game.
All right. Any others? Yep, that's about right. Just simply, they are decisions made by players of your game. But the way these choices can be presented can depend from game to game. As I have two examples up here, one on the left is Fire Emblem Fates, and the one on the right is Dead Cells. And sometimes choices can be as explicit as the one on the left, where you're literally given like a dialogue box and you choose which option you want, and the choices of that might reflect into the game. But also they could be more subtle inside of your game through, say, level design, where in Dead Cells, in this scenario, there's a lot of choices that the player could take in this scenario. They could jump on top, jump to the right into that little pit. They could keep attacking the enemies on the right. They could dodge out of the way of that enemy coming in from the right. So the way these choices are presenting can depend, and the way the designers present these choices are very dependent on what kind of game they're making. So, why do we give player choices?
To make them feel like they have agency over their play.
That's one. Yep.
To allow for multiple paths of play. So if you've got a slightly different personality and you want to handle it in this way, if we give the choice of two ways to handle it, then people can choose the way that they would enjoy the most.
All correct. Mainly that choices impact the player experience, and we might ask ourselves, like, when playing games, like, how will this change the way I play the game? What will happen in the long run if I make this choice? How will it affect the game? Will it make it easier or harder? You know, some people might want to make choices that make the games easier for themselves, or sometimes it might be more of a personality thing, as you mentioned. And it also gives the player like a feeling that they are affecting the game state, like a sort of sense of agency, that they are making the game change based on their actions. And these choices can keep our players engaged, can reduce boredom and or feeling like they're just like kind of going along with the game, or going along while the game is dragging them rather than like being along with the journey. And depending on the outcomes of such choices, of course, they might feel good about themselves. There's everyone kind of agree, disagree with these points.
An example of this is I was just playing Europa Universalis, and I was Berlin. I can't remember the exact name of the country, but basically I decided to invade my neighbor, and as a result I was able to take control of my neighbor and take control of another country, but then everyone else who was next to me said we don't like that, and they all signed a group and declared war on me, and then like 100,000 troops just walked into my territory and destroyed me.
Classic case of diplomacy. Okay, have you ever heard of that game?
Yep.
Yeah, sometimes choices can be good or bad. But sometimes we make choices that are bad for us, but at least the games can sometimes reflect that kind of choice, like decision making, especially in games like political scenarios. When you make such hostile actions, the game responds in hostile ways because it affects the player experience in that way. It makes you decide whether you want to take that risk or keep playing it safe until someone else does. Right. So we discussed why we make choices, but what are some characteristics of effective or important choices that we can make? Some things we can do to make choices meaningful and or effective to the player, and choices that we should maybe avoid so we don't just make the players just do menial things or small things that don't really affect the game as much. If anyone has anything they want to say before I possibly reveal some things.
One thing I despise is when you make a choice and then in like a story mode, and then as soon as like the game continues, you realize that whatever you chose in that story option had no effect on anything whatsoever, and you just said a thing, and you got one text box, and then you never heard about that again.
I would somewhat argue it depends on the game that you're choosing. Because some games it would be really nice or really important to do like some form of like calculation where it's like, oh, this thing is better than this thing because of the stats. And other games, it might not be as wanted that you would want to do that. Like some games are a lot more geared towards optimization than others, or something along the lines of like when you were talking about like player choice and like a dialogue tree or something like that. Sometimes even though like the choice might not have felt like it meant something, I know that there are some games that get away with that and giving like the illusion of choice rather than the actual effect of choice, which kind of helps you to like relate with the game a little bit more because you can kind of put more into the game, depending on how well it's done. But it kind of really depends on where your game is about to figure out which type you want to do. Because there are some games with like gear and material where it's like I don't really care that much about the stats. I just want to do things.
Yeah, and the whole like illusion of choice is a very I don't know what the word is to describe it, but a very like
Precarious balance.
yeah, because it's like a lot of people will like say they hate it, but only on the games that made it obvious, in which choices didn't really mean anything. Like for the longest time, I think like from what I recall, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I do remember at some point someone found out that the Telltale games, like they looked inside the code or something, and they found that like a lot of the choices didn't actually affect the game, and it made like audiences mad because they were like, what the heck, these choices didn't mean anything. But like for the longest time, they have fooled them into thinking that those choices had meaning. So it's like at that same time, it's like because you've been fooled for that long, maybe that's what the designers did a good job.
Why did they need to look in the code? You just needed to play the game twice.
I have no idea. I mean, this might have been something I read, I could have misremembered, but
Yeah.
this is something I remember.
Would you really want to play through a Telltale game like
See,
more than twice?
That's my problem. Is whenever I play a game, I always play the first beginning of it, just because I'm weird like this. The beginning like part, I play that like 5 times. Because I just do that automatically, and so choices in games that don't mean anything have a lot more of an effect on the way I play games than it would on other people, because I'm like, oh, I played through this 5 times, I did the same thing 5 times, it didn't make a difference, and so that annoys me slightly. But that's just a personal play style, which makes no sense, because no one else plays that way, but.
Yeah, which is also interesting because like the idea of like player choice and like being like the same outcome happening, it's like when it comes to something where it's like you have multiple choices, but it's like more based on like the path that you decide to take, you can kind of still get the illusion of choice where it's like you have something like Hollow Knight where you found something through like one path, but you could have found it through these other paths, and you're like, okay, I guess I'm going through this like the right way. When it's like, or you like made the choice to go through it like that. I don't know where I'm going with this. Never mind.
Yeah.
I think a branching path.
Yeah, where it's like even though it's kind of branching, it was never actually really branching, but it like makes you feel like you're making like the way that you decided to traverse it was kind of like an active choice. The thing that I was also thinking of was like I didn't play it, but in Breath of the Wild you can go to wherever you want, for example. But it's like even though like your choice isn't necessarily like unique or different depending on like how you approach something, it's like it kind of is because of the way that you did it. I don't know how to describe.
It's kind of like the embodiment of like, it's not about the destination, about the journey kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't really like the destination's the same, but it's like a player might take one path to get to there, but another player might take another path, and it's like different.
Yeah.
Kind of like that.
And open world games have just inherently a lot of choice in them, and that's why I think a lot of open world games have a problem where they're not interacting with your choice at all. So like some games, I can't think of anything specifically right now because I haven't played an open world game in forever. But on the other hand, a game like what's it called? Breath of the Wild, it gives you a lot of interaction with your choice because you've got a lot of like minor things, all of them slightly improving your ability to go beat Ganon, all of them seem like this is what I actually need to do. Huh?
But it's okay. Just messing with you.
They're trying to go beat Ganon in the Zelda game? What?
I would never have guessed.
Cool. These are all great things to hear. A lot of these are not, so it's great to hear. Anyone else have anything you want to mention? Cool. So I just have a couple examples on here. It's not going to encapsulate everything, of course, but just some things to think about. So like what makes an effective choice? To answer this question, it kind of boils down to a few important facts about the player. A, the player wants to win, and B, the player wants to have fun. So usually a lot of the choices you make, or the choices you give your players, kind of want to fall within one of these two things, or at least keep in mind these two things. Of course, there's many different ways of approaching this problem. So this means like an effective choice in your game at the end will affect the goal. So we talked about earlier about like branching paths leading to one destination, but each branching path kind of is like a different experience for the player. And of course, like depending on which path might appeal to different players. So like maybe there's an optimized path, or maybe there's a more fun path, or there's a more challenging path, stuff like that. And also like certain effective choices might have consequences. So for instance, you talked about like the kind of diplomacy situation where, you know, you as a person might make this decision because you're kind of like, maybe you're in the role of the character you're in, or maybe it's like a choice you just want to see what would happen if you did it, and thus sometimes games might give you like a result that kind of gives you some drawbacks and consequences for making such decisions. And so like it also like, even if these things are kind of backhanding the player a little bit, sometimes these things can also add to the experience, because it's like in certain scenarios it's like, I made this risky choice and this thing happened. Well, I kind of half expected that because, you know, I made the active choice to do that. Or, oh, I made this like risky choice and I got away with it. That's amazing. Like, oh, I feel so lucky. You know, things like that. And these are sometimes choices you might want to present to your player, depending on your game.
Yeah. And a game that does trick really bad that I just thought of is, have anyone heard of The Surge? It is a Souls-like game, so it's trying to be like Dark Souls a little bit, but it's like sci-fi techno. And it has a reoccurring problem where all of its hallways in areas tend to look exactly the same. And usually this is fine because there's not that many ways you can go through a level. So usually the fact that the level design is linear prevents the fact that the levels are impossible to tell apart from getting super annoying. But in their last level, they tried to have a lot of choices and a lot of decisions happen in this one. And as a result, there's a lot of different paths through the level. But due to the fact that this level, just like all the other levels, has very poorly designed or poorly artistically shown hallways, and so every single hallway looks exactly like the other, you're at the starting point, you make the choice, and then 5 feet in, you're like, I have no idea where I am, I'm completely lost. And I was unable to beat the game because I couldn't figure out. It became like an unbearably difficult maze. And so they gave you a ton of choice, but each of the choices was equally unenjoyable, and so it just wasn't able to sustain my interest.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of a similar point to what I will be getting to in a bit. But yeah, like some scenarios where it's like you give them too many choices, or some choices feel too similar, and it might affect the player a little bit, since we, like humans, tend to notice patterns like pretty easily, as well as like we have like kind of that like weird sense of like, oh, I feel like I've done this before, and like you see something in a game, you think you made a different decision, but the same outcome happens, we tend to be disappointed. So there's a lot of small things that can happen from choices that sometimes the designers put in front of you. Alright. And so what are some characters of like either not so effective or important choices? So like I have a few options on like what doesn't make for effective choices. And this is kind of like one that we might have discussed before, where making like a choice has no impact towards the player, the goal, and or has no consequences. Basically just a choice for the sake of being a choice. And these kind of choices may seem harmless, but as we mentioned, can also negatively affect the player experience, since they know it won't affect them. we discussed like the dialogue systems or like the reaching the same destination. Those things can work if like they make it so like making those choices are more fun than the actual outcome of those choices.
Yeah.
But sometimes like you just are given a choice for the sake of being given a choice, but you could have axed that out and it would have been the same experience. You would have been better off doing that rather than just throwing like A, B, or C, and then like not either or will just get you the same thing. So, if anyone has any comments on that?
But so, since there are like 4 things, player, goal, or probably just game state would probably be another one.
Yeah.
Since there's 3 of those, you can have it not really affect the game state, like the Telltale games. You can have it not really affect the game state or the goal too incredibly. Like no matter what choice you made, you're still going to do the same thing. But as long as the player think it's having an effect, and in Telltale games usually it's one playthrough, then it is an effective choice still, right?
Yeah, in that sense, it's like, because the designers might be making an assumption like a player is only going to play our game once, so, you know, we can kind of get away with something like this because we don't assume that, like, you're going to play the game more than once. It's like a one-time experience and then you move on to the next one. But of course, you know, it's very much a trade-off, because if you do get those players that are like, I want to go back and make this decision to see what happens, then, you know, the player has looked behind the curtain, essentially. Like, they're like, oh, okay. So it's all a matter of just like looking at the context of your game. Because even games like those, it's like it doesn't affect the goal and it doesn't affect like certain things, but it might affect like the player in that instance, like out of the game. Like, oh, I made this decision because I felt it makes sense in this time. So it made the player themselves feel good, even if it didn't really affect the game, which is another thing that could work to your advantage. Because a lot of design is just trade-offs, pros and cons. And I think I put up another point that like a not effective choice would also be one in which there is one choice that is just drastically better than the others. Where if you're like appealing to optimizers or you're appealing to players who just want to beat your game, if you have one choice in your game that is very much better than the others in terms of like value or any other factor, then you're not really giving them a choice, so to speak. It's more of just like it's just kind of some options are there, but most players are going to lean towards one, and it's not really a choice at that point, kind of thing. Some games kind of want to do this, or some games kind of do this accidentally. Like if you have like a system in which like a starting item might be much better than the others, but like if you add later on that the item is weaker towards the end game, then it might work, but sometimes it can just have the opposite effect on you, where most players are going to do that either way. I think like I forget, but there's like Kingdom Hearts. There was like a system where like you can choose how your experience growth goes through like some weird quiz, and like I think players, once they figured that out, were just kind of leaning towards one of those choices because it was better for the game experience.
So I play Kingdom Hearts a lot. I remember I had a guidebook for Kingdom Hearts 2. It not only affected your stat growth, but it affected like when you would unlock certain abilities. And like a certain combination of it's like you choose to power up one stat and grow less in another, and that affects your abilities, right? There was this one combination that would give you the ability to increase item drop chances at like level 99. So no one likes that because you want your items to get through the game. Like you would get less materials and less crafting materials for like your equipment.
Thank you for that insight, because I haven't played Kingdom Hearts myself.
Yeah.
But yeah, something like that, where like if a player kind of knows about a system like that, they might lean more towards a certain option because the other one is just inherently worse or better than the others. Because, you know, players want to win, as I mentioned up here. That's one of the things that the player wants to do. And so, you know, when you're in that Kingdom Hearts scenario, some players want to have items early on, and if there's a choice that says you don't get items until later when you're almost done with the game, players are probably going to be like, I don't want that, I don't want this option. And it kind of makes it so that option is inherently just like the option everyone wants to do. So yeah, any comments on that?
Okay, right, so
Right.
I basically,
And
so I looked
another choice, which I believe we discussed, is giving players too many
really
choices.
couldn't find anything because the buildings
will
are
actually
supposed to
negatively
have
affect the player.
to be
Kind of
built
like
from
a whole like
sideways or from below
giving
or
them too many
from
options
top.
kind of paralyzes them a
They
little
don't
bit because
really
they
have
don't know
these
what to do.
interesting
Um,
shapes other than just a
Because it
circle.
has the inverse effect of either giving them too much
So, I
anxiety
guess
about your
we
game
should-
or boredom, in which you give them too many choices and now they just don't know what to do, or you give them too many choices and you know maybe they just want to play
Yeah,
the game done
so
because they're just like
That will be
I'm done
just
with that. There's too much stuff for me to do.
I guess
and they
that
might
would be
just
just
get,
it.
as
So
I
there will be
mentioned,
fans
overwhelmed.
running, so I make the fans run
Some
there.
games do fall into the line of like micromanagement. You know, there's a reason why games like StarCraft and Age of Empires exist because they appeal to a certain group of players who like micromanagement and controlling every little thing in your game. But of course, for a general audience, that might not appeal to them. Where most people kind of want to play like a game that they can just kind of sit down and relax and just kind of play through like in a more casual way. So it's just kind of like what you're trying to appeal to. So this point might be, if you're making RTS, this point might not apply to you. But if you're making like, say, like a platform, then making like too many choices would possibly overwhelm someone. But of course, it depends on how you go about it. Yeah.
And if you give, like in a lot of the Ubisoft games, if you give the players a lot of choices and aren't explicitly clear on which one's like the best path, then they can just start doing the things in like some random order. And especially if a lot of Ubisofts have these problems, they have a repetitive gameplay loop. So you go to this place, you do the thing, and then that is like a one style of playing the game, and every single place you go to, you get the exact same gameplay. And if you're walking through the street on your way to your important mission, and there's 5 of those things, and you go and do every single one because they're there, you might as well, then you just play 5 of the exact same gameplay thing over and over again, and then you just get tired with that. And before you get to your point where you've got this interesting, fun thing, they get tired because they had these options, and I might as well take them, they're on my way, and then they got bored with them, and they'll either never interact with that part of the game again, or they'll stop playing the game. Either one could be a negative to your gameplay experience.
I think there was something that I remember from a book that I was reading. It was like from The Witcher, and it's talking about like this idea of like too many choices, and how they wanted to address it. It was like the way that they went through The Witcher 3, because that game is like super expensive. There's like thousands of hours of content, and you would think that like given that much content that you would be like, oh, there's too many choices. But they explicitly made the choice to be like, each one of these missions, despite the fact that they're just side missions, there has to be a reason for it to happen. And because they made it, instead of having like, okay, just go do this fetch quest, like that's one of the examples they gave where like you would just do a fetch quest, they're like, this mission has to have a reason for being in this place, or why they would have to do it. And even though there's like so many choices, it's kind of the way that it's presented that it makes it so that they're not like super crippling the fact that there's so many of them, I think. That's just something that I remember that
So I haven't played Witcher, but from what I understood from what you said, is it kind of like if there's like something that would normally just be like a typical like, go kill 5 goblins quest, they kind of present in a way like maybe through the narrative that like this thing is happening, if you can go do that, that'll be good, kind of thing.
So one quest that I always think back to when I think to The Witcher and how they do super minor side quests is you go to this town, and the way you usually get minor side quests is just there's a flyer on a board and they say, hey, we need help doing something. And so you will pick up the flyer, and then I can't remember the exact location, but it's in like a swamp area. And some guy's like, hey, there's been a head attack, there's a monster, I need help. And you go to where that guy is, and he's working on something. And he's like, there's been screams out in the marsh at night, I don't know exactly what's going on, but some guys went to go check and they haven't come back. Could you go help? And you look for them. And so the first part of the mission is you go and you look for the thing, and you find some dead people, and then you do like a tracking session, and then you find like a secret door, and then you enter a place, and then you fight the boss or the enemy, and then you kill it, and then you leave. But along that path, at the beginning, you do not know what you're fighting until you get about 3 3/4 of the way into the game, into the place. And then once you're those 3/4 in, depending on like what items you just have on yourself, you will probably go and hunt around for a couple ingredients in order to make a specific poison/potion to make your fight with this creature more easy. So they add, even though it's like a simple go kill 5 goblins, they don't tell you it's the goblins. They just tell you that there's something out in the marsh, go kill it. And even if you fought one of these creatures before, which most of the time this is the first interaction you have with this creature, then even if you fought one before, it's still an interesting, oh, this is one of those guys. I fought them before, I know how to fight them. Or it's a, what is this, how do I fight them? And those are like the 2 options, and that gives you a little bit more interaction with the game. Even though you could say it in a manner where it's, you get the quest, you go to the dude, he tells you where it is, you go do like a little bit of investigation, you figure out what it is, and then you go kill the boss. Every single one follows that path, slightly moving stuff around every once in a while. Since you don't know what the enemy is at the beginning, it puts a little bit of mystery in it, and how you go about and where you collect the items gives you a little bit more choice within the short-term quest.
Yeah, it's pretty good. Because I haven't played The Witcher myself, but it sounds like they do that kind of whole like making a choice effective kind of thing, even if it's more of just like a side thing. They at least involve it into the narrative.
Yeah, and that's just like a micro quest. Side quests, which are just slightly bigger than that, and they tend to have full arcs for the most part, and like actual interactions with like how the world goes from then on.
Yeah, I haven't played it either. I just thought about it.
It's really well designed.
Yeah, which is why I kind of mentioned, because it sounded like it was very well designed. It was also very well received, and I heard a lot of people like a lot of my friends talking about it when they went through their playthrough. And I feel like part of it is the fact that even though there's like so many choices, the kind of like loop of the choice, like the gameplay loop of the choices is separated enough that it doesn't feel repetitive from each individual like experience, like each individual quest, side quest, or like billboard pickup. Even though it can be somewhat similar in a sense, because I remember there was a video that I remember watching where it was like, even though there's like these high action moments in one game, if it keeps on happening, then it'll just exhaust the player. Even though they have all of these choices of like, I want to take on this combat like this, it'll be like, okay, let's slow it down a bit, and like the games that like can slow it down and like you can do this and this and then this, kind of like win out in how long you can players tend to play them.
Yeah, that kind of goes into like game flow, which we have done workshops of it in the past.
Next week, I think we have another one.
I think we do.
Yeah, me.
Yeah, so it's kind of just like the whole like, don't give your players too much anxiety or too much boredom, because then otherwise your players like lose engagement kind of thing.
And then, but like sometimes a little bit of repetition is good in the game, because then it gives you something to break. So if you give someone an expectation, now you have an expectation which you can subvert. Going back to Witcher, sometimes, occasionally, very rarely on a quest, you'll go to fight a monster, and you'll do all the research, and then you'll be like, wait a minute, this guy who's dead, who I'm trying to figure out why he was killed by a monster, he's got a bunch of arrows in him. Hello again. Monsters don't use bows, and then you realize that it's robbery or something, and they were trying to hide it and make it seem like it was a monster attack, but it was actually a bunch of people doing it.
So, any other thoughts? Great. And these are just kind of like recapping what we discussed earlier about like what make an effective choice. So we discussed how giving a player a handful of choices, each with their own benefits and drawbacks, could help enrich the experience. We've been discussing Witcher a lot. I'm just curious, like, when you take like a side quest, does it like, is there like a time state in the game? Like if you take the quest and you don't do another one, does it make the other quest like worse, or do you just go to that one whenever?
Not in like the micro quests or side quests, I don't think. There are some side quests that if you complete one side quest, it'll have an effect on another side quest. So like there's layered side quests, because like there's this one side quest where you're in the middle of your side quest, and then as part of that side quest, you'll get another side quest. So it's a side quest to your side quest. And as part of this side quest, how you interact with this at the end affects how this a little bit longer side quest ends up.
Oh, okay. Because that just made me think of like an idea where like if someone made a game where like if you had multiple choices and you took one choice and you didn't go immediately do the other two, then it makes the other two like change a little bit.
Yeah.
That might of course be out of scope, but just something like that could make things kind of like their own benefits and drawbacks.
If I remember, there was like I think it might have been Metal Gear, where it was like one of the, I forget which one, so I don't know the name of the main character. But the main character is supposed to be like trying to save like this one of the towers from a terrorist attack or something, and the player expects like, oh, I can do whatever I want on the way there, but then if they like don't get there, if they don't like figure it out in time, like they take too long to get down there, then the terrorist attack happens, and then he's like it kind of follows him for a while, like, oh, you let this happen, and then it kind of changes the effect of like what happens.
I think that was,
Was it Metal Gear?
what's the one where your arms get chopped off and then you have metal arms, and Deus Ex,
Deus Ex.
Mankind Divided, or one of those. I think it's Deus Ex Mankind Divided, because they put you in like a hotel and you can go around and like flush all the toilets and throw stuff. But if it takes you more than like 15 minutes to get to the helicopter, then the group of people that you're trying to go save all get killed. And then the option of saving that group of people becomes invisible because they're all dead.
Which is kind of interesting to like, maybe like not necessarily like, I guess you could say subvert the idea of like, oh, you can do everything inside of a game, but like to give it more of a time, like you have to do it in this amount of time.
Yeah.
Kind of.
I think a lot of those choices are kind of like very extreme kind of things, where it's like if you don't do it, then you just can't do it ever.
Yeah.
Because like it could be interesting if like a designer made it so like, oh, go save this girl, and then you don't like, you maybe like wait a week, and then like, oh, like the girl's now in an even worse state, so when you go rescue her, like she's now like traumatized. So it's like if you had you saved her earlier, then it's like she would've been fine. So that kind of thing. So just something, just a little brain exercise just popped up in my head when thinking of this. And so another thing that like makes effective choices is when a game makes the player the active participant in the game state. You know, random punishments in games very much would confuse and frustrate players more than if they made like a bad or risky choice and get punished there. So
Invade Russia during the winter. No!
poor choices. And then lastly for this is a choice that can benefit the player in or out of the game, which is actually kind of important because we've been discussing a lot about like illusions of choice, and like even if they had no effect on the game, the players themselves were affected. And so this is also a point when I was thinking of like character creation. Character creation most of the time has no mechanical effect on the player. I mean, there's probably games out there where it does, but usually when you're just making a character and you spend like an hour trying to make like a character exactly how you want them to look, and you go into game, has no effect on the game itself, but you as the player are like, ah, yes, I've made like the best looking character, and like they look like this, and that's kind of like an example of someone feeling a benefit to themselves out of game just from something that the designers put in for them.
One of my favorite examples of this is in Mass Effect, where you can spend hours creating your character, and then like half the time, whenever you're in a fight, you're wearing a mask and you can't see the character at all. All that effort, it's just like completely pointless. But people still put tons of effort into making their character look like them or the person that they want to be.
Alright. Now, I believe after this, I have an exercise.
Ooh.
Just a small little exercise. And it's just kind of just like taking our design hats for a minute and putting us into some scenarios, possibly maybe like another designer pitched it to you, or maybe this is something that you see in a game and you might want to look at. And so what I have here are some scenarios, and we determine whether they are fun or unfun, you know, as designers. And if they're unfun, what solutions we can use from what we discussed to help fix these. My first example, a player is starting up generic life simulator. A player makes a character. After 5 minutes of play, they fall ill and die, and they have to restart the game. Fun or unfun?
It depends on how long you spend making the character.
I think it's ironically fun. It's one of those games that will captivate people for like half a month and then will die. But probably unfun from a design perspective.
But my mind's out of not.
So a way, yeah, probably unfun. But if the way to make it fun is if you seriously limit the amount of time they have to design their character, and have it where the next play session is affected by their previous character. So one game that's kind of like this. I can't remember what its name, but it's like a royal card game. And basically, you're a king, and you make decisions with cards.
Oh, like the Tinder-like game?
Yeah. It's like, yeah, Tinder swipe game. And you always have two options. And your kings, you're a succession of kings. And your kings usually last 5 to 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
But the effects that that king had is incredible on the next king and the next king. And you're trying to get your line to go as long as possible. And so even though you're not spending time creating the character, but even though each one of these kings you're playing is a very short amount of time, as long as they have an effect on the next one, and it's not the worst thing ever that they died in a short amount of time.
I mean, there's plenty of games that get satisfaction out of players from just being a character creator as well. So it's like the gameplay itself is probably not the thing that entertains the player. If they were to get a game like this, as given that the actual designing of the character is pretty interesting to do, because even if it's in depth, it might not be the most fun to manipulate. But if it is interesting enough, despite the fact that the straight up gameplay loop is not the best design, it's probably still a fun game for those people.
If a way that this could be really fun is if it gives you that super intense character creator, but there's a bunch of options locked off, like certain haircuts are locked off. So if in that 5 minutes you're able to make it to the barber shop and get that haircut, you're able to now use it whenever you're making a character from the start. That might be super interesting. So you have 5 minutes to get the items you need in order to, you gotta go get these special dyes in order to now have this dye, to now you can have green hair whenever you start the game. That would be an interesting way of making a character creator.
So, good, bad idea for
Yes, that's-
roguelike character creator?
Yes. You create your character and you can have all this control over it, but there's a bunch of stuff locked off.
You unlock it through playing. Yep, it's a roguelike now.
And you're a beauty contestant, I guess? That makes sense. And you're trying to become the most beautiful character, but the only way to do that is to get the better hair, the better makeup, and all the other better stuff.
You want to be the best looking corpse at the open casket.
So yeah, we came up with something interesting off of generic life simulator. Now, my second proposition. A player is playing a game of generic war simulator. They have to create an army of 1,000 soldiers before they initiate play. They must select each individual soldier, pick their class, pick their weapon type, age, gender, and name. Then after doing that, they can finally start the game. Fun or unfun?
Not fun. It, like, at a smaller than 1,000, if you could get it down to below 150, it might be possible to make it fun, but at 1,000, that's not, it's too many people, you won't remember all of them. But if you get it below to 150, or probably even lower than that, probably around 50, it can get to a small enough little brigade of troops that you know everyone's name. And now, not only when you're strategizing and sending your soldier to go do a thing, not only is this some dude, number 5, who's important because of his warfare, this is Jameson, who's got a wife and kids, and is 5 feet tall, and has a limp because a couple of years ago he got an arrow in the knee. And so now he has this character, and so your military choices aren't just about where should the soldier go, where he's needed most. It's, I don't want Jameson to die. But 1,000 is way too many.
I think that even in the case of a smaller amount, it's probably not good, since the point of making something where you customize your like characters in any regard is mostly to encourage a connection with that character. You need to be able to limit it enough that you can actually form a connection. I would argue that even in the case of like 100, there would probably be too many characters, considering people complain about when there's like 50 characters that are important in one scene from like movies or something.
The reason I said 150 is because that's the number of people that you can like actually be friends with. Any more than that, and people just stop disappearing off your friends' radar. And so that's like a research number, but it would definitely be smaller than 150.
Yeah, seeing as like most like games or bond with characters, there's probably only like a handful of people you remember anyway. So
I don't think it's possible to make this game fun.
How
At
do you-
least if it's all at once, that you would be experienced, or you would have to create the characters, which you can only start the campaign once you select the characters. Now, if it was something more along the lines of you make the characters as the years go on, or the gameplay goes on, it would probably be more salvageable, because I think stuff like XCOM kind of does that, where you can kind of
Oh, yeah.
figure out what your characters do as you get them. That's far less than 1,000.
Some of them you can't even edit some of the things until they get to like a high rank. So you've got this soldier, and then he gets to like a specific rank, and suddenly he's no longer from Canada. He's from Britain, and his hair color is completely different. And no, he's a she, and just completely changes the entire person.
So yeah, it seems like we had a
Britain's only
couple.
real change, but whatever.
We had a couple propositions for what you could do here. Cut down the numbers is definitely one thing I heard. Or just like if you do get soldiers, just have them just be randomly generated for you, and that way, like maybe later you want to change them, or possibly just get what you are given, and maybe you just feel in bond with that random character anyways.
Or give them a specifically crafted character. I know some RPGs,
Mhm.
like I guess even what's the one that everyone was talking about a while ago? The yeah, Fire Emblem.
Oh, okay.
They give you just here's some characters with like actual personality instead of just a random person.
Yeah.
Which it has the same result of giving you a connection to the soldier and making you not want to lose them, but without all of the trouble of giving you 1,000 choices right there at the beginning.
Yeah. Good stuff. Good stuff. All right. Good. And so, mostly this is just kind of wrap up. So like when we designers are maybe working on our game projects and possibly talking with our team about what we do in terms of like this could apply to level design, system design, anything. When we give our players choices, we can ask ourselves these questions when we are giving our when we present choices to our players. Like, what does it add to the player's experience? Even if the choices do not have an inherent outcome for the game, do they affect the player in any way? Mass Effect dialogue, Telltale games, just like even if the dialogue doesn't affect the game, can the player still feel like something of an experience from making those choices? If we have multiple systems in our game, what does each individual system have to offer to our game, whether it's bad or good for the player? Multiple paths in a level, multiple weapons to choose from in the beginning, multiple experience growths. And if we have multiple paths in a level, are they meaningful to our player when deciding to play our game? Will there be one obviously bad path to take, or will there be obviously one quickest path to take when making the level? Or are we making levels that each have their own like different experiences that if a player wants to play our game again, maybe they're like, oh, I've done this path, maybe I want to try this one. You know, things like that to give our players a different experience through the choices they make. And some closing notes are when we are giving choices, will they have impact on the experience? Are we giving too many or too little choices? Are they negatively or positively affecting our player? You know, just some things that you can all walk away with by the end of this workshop. But that's probably the concluding part of our workshop. Is there any last things you all want to discuss?
Sometimes, as a designer, what you're dealing with isn't necessarily, so like in the game that I'm currently working on, when I was given it at the very beginning, it was already like somewhat under construction. And they were like, okay, now you're a designer on this. And so our character has a melee attack and a ranged attack. And so myself and the other designer, Chase, were like, okay, if the ranged attack does as much damage as the melee attack, there's no reason to ever use the melee attack because that puts you at too much risk. You can't see what's coming. So the range attack has to have 1/10 of the damage, or if not less damage, than the melee attack, so that both options become more viable choices. But even then, it might still be more beneficial to just go with the range attack, like a one play style. But we'll see. I gotta start playtesting that game a bunch.
Yeah, speaking of like projects, like I'm in a capstone class and like me and Luis are the designers and we are trying to make like a game where you have different skills that you can equip and unequip to try and like get different builds. And because it's a roguelike, you can play it multiple times and get different abilities each time and possibly change up your sets. And we designers have been thinking that like there are multiple abilities that synergize with one another. So if a player gets these two abilities, they're gonna have a different experience than if they play it again and get like two different abilities. But we are encountering some like numbers and like some similar problems to like what you're getting at, where it's like if we have a ranged attack and a melee attack, well then why won't I just use the ranged attack because it's much safer? And so it's kind of like now we have to do some balancing and some number crunching to figure out like how we can make these two abilities have their own sets of trade-offs and stuff, so that we're not just making our players have a dominant strategy of once I have this one ability, this is the one ability I want. So yeah.
But depending on like the game, you also want them, if it's like a longer form game where you're like getting a bunch of abilities, you also want them to make it where, like if we have no upgrades in our game, but if ours was more like a longer form, hey, eventually you're going to be a very specific class and there's other people with you type game, then hey, focusing in on your range attacks or where it's not, if you had focused on your melee attack, it wouldn't be too much better than that. But since you focused on your range attack, now your range attack is like super effective compared to your melee attack. Whereas if someone had focused in on their melee attack, they could get their melee attack super high. I think like certain MMOs do that fairly well.
Yeah, lots of systems in those.
Yeah. It's so complex.
All right. And of course, when I link up the workshop, you all can look at that, click the link. But that's where most of the information I got from this workshop came from, plus just like personal experiences with doing stuff like this. But that should be all. Thank you for coming.